This is the third and final video focusing on American foreign policy after the Cold War and 9/11 terrorist attacks. Focusing on foreign policy, the United States faces ongoing economic, political, military, and social challenges in the post-Cold War era and following the attacks of September 11th, 2001. The post-Cold War period and the attacks on September 11th, 2001 presented new foreign policy challenges for the United States. The post-Cold War period and the attacks on September 11th, 2001 impacted the military in the following ways: increased defense spending as a result of the war on terrorism, role of the United States and United Nations in addressing political and social unrest in the Middle East, the control of weapons of mass destruction in areas of the world perceived as a threat to world stability. Immediately after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, President George W. Bush announces the start of a war on terror, initially focusing on al-Qaeda, but eventually any terrorist group that poses a threat to America will be targeted. From very early on, it is clear that this will be a long and drawn-out military conflict. It is not a war that can easily end. It is a fight against a mentality shared by many individuals from many locations. It is not as simple as forcing a nation to surrender and agree to peace terms as happened in World War I and World War II. Not that that was simple either. Fighting began with airstrikes on Afghanistan in 2001. The terrorist group al-Qaeda was based in Afghanistan, and it was believed that Osama bin Laden, the head of al-Qaeda, who ordered the 9/11 terrorist attacks, was also in Afghanistan. Ground troops began operations in November 2001. The U.S. military and its allies had success right away, but would remain in Afghanistan for over a decade due to a lack of stability in the country, as well as difficulty in finding Osama bin Laden and other leaders of al-Qaeda. While the war in Afghanistan was going on, the U.S. began a second war in Iraq in March 2003. This war began due to a mistaken belief that Iraq was home to weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass destruction could include nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons. The war in Iraq lasted until 2011. As the war in Iraq ended, a new threat began with the rise of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. The war in Afghanistan officially ended in 2014, although there has been conflict between the U.S. and groups in Afghanistan since then. Osama bin Laden was captured and killed by American troops. The U.S. still maintains a military presence in both Iraq and Afghanistan to this day. Remember that defense spending decreased during the 1990s due to the end of the Cold War? Defense spending will then increase after 9/11. And the war on terror has cost the U.S. government over $6 trillion since it began nearly 20 years ago. The war on terror has been a long-running war. Terrorists, including Osama bin Laden, have been captured. However, there has been political and social unrest as new governments and groups have been established in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, groups like ISIS. These groups have shown the instability that is present in the Middle Eastern region. The United States and the United Nations have been involved in trying to bring stability to the region, although problems still exist today. After the U.S. used 2 atomic bombs in Japan to end World War II, other nations have tried to develop similarly powerful weapons. Atomic or nuclear weapons are considered weapons of mass destruction, as are chemical and biological weapons. These are weapons capable of causing greater harm than typical weapons of war. The possession of these weapons is subject to international treaties. Since September 11th, the potential of a terrorist group or rogue nation developing or acquiring and possibly using these types of weapons has been a threat that the U.S. and the United Nations have been concerned with. The war in Iraq began over U.S. and British intelligence believing that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Although those claims were unfounded, other nations such as Iran and North Korea have made progress at times over the past 2 decades on creating weapons of mass destruction. The U.S. has not used military force against these nations, but instead sanctions to disrupt the ability of these nations to develop those powerful weapons. We conclude with two questions that were air test questions related to this content about America and how it changed after the Cold War and 9/11, focusing on foreign policy issues. Our first question: how did the United States respond to the events of September 11th, 2001? A, by increasing the size of its nuclear weapons stockpile. B, by ending its economic partnerships with former Soviet countries. C, by adopting isolationist policies to insulate itself against further aggression. Or D, by pursuing military action in countries that were accused of supporting terrorists. In the second question, pick two. So which two of the following were challenges faced by the United States since the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks? A, responding to instability in the Middle East. B, protecting against possible attacks in the United States. C, preventing the spread of communism. Or D, competing in the space race.